The house felt hollow without Luke. Not just empty, hollow, like something vital had been scraped out of the walls, leaving only the shell behind. For 22 years, I had built my life around him, woven myself into the fabric of our marriage so tightly that now, with him gone, I wasn't sure where I ended and the loss began. A week ago, I was still his wife. A week ago, I still believed in the quiet routines of our life, in the steadiness of it. And then, in a single breath, it was gone. It just happened, Liv. I didn't mean to hurt you. As if intent mattered. As if the fact that he hadn't planned on breaking me made it any easier to bear. But the worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the relief in his voice. Like confessing had unburdened him. Like I should somehow be grateful that he had finally set me free. I had called Rael that night, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "Your father is leaving," I had whispered, my voice brittle and foreign to my own ears. "He's been cheating. It's over." And without hesitation, my son had answered, "I'm coming home." By evening, he was there. The moment I opened the door, he pulled me into his arms, holding me like he used to when he was small, when he still thought I had the power to fix everything. Now it was the other way around. He held me, solid and steady, while I crumbled. I cried into his shoulder, my fingers gripping the fabric of his jacket, as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. "I've got you, Mom," he murmured, rubbing slow, soothing circles on my back. "I'm here." And he was. Rael moved back into his old room without a word about how long he planned to stay. He didn't ask if I wanted him there, didn't try to tell me how to move forward. He just settled in, filling the house with his presence the way he had before he left for college. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Grateful, yes, but also exposed. Rael had always been perceptive, too much so for his own good. He saw things I tried to hide, knew when I was lying, even when I lied to myself. One evening, as we sat on the couch, I stared down at the half-empty bottle of wine between us, swirling my glass absently. "I can't believe he did this," I murmured. "I gave him everything. I built my whole life around him. And now it's just gone." Rael didn't answer right away. He let my words settle, heavy and bitter between us. Finally, he exhaled. "He's an idiot," he said. "You deserved better." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's what people say when they don't know what else to say. He turned to me then, his expression unreadable. "No, Mom. I mean it. You deserved so much better." Something about the way he said it made my throat tighten. I took another sip of wine, averting my eyes. "Maybe. But what now? What do I even do with myself?" "You live," he said simply. "You figure out what makes you happy." I scoffed, shaking my head. "I don't even know who I am without him." "Then I guess it's time to find out." I wanted to tell him it wasn't that simple, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I leaned my head back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. "I hate him," I whispered. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if it was true. Rael shifted beside me, and a moment later, I felt his fingers wrap around mine. A small gesture, but grounding. I closed my eyes, letting myself take comfort in the warmth of his hand. The days passed in a strange blur. Mornings used to mean waking up to the sound of Luke's razor buzzing in the bathroom, the scent of his aftershave lingering in the air. Now, mornings were quiet, except for the occasional sound of Rael making coffee in the kitchen. Evenings were the hardest. That was when the loneliness crept in, wrapping around me like a second skin. I would sit in the dimly lit living room, staring at nothing, drowning in memories I wished I could erase. That was when Rael would find me. He never pushed, never forced me to talk. He just sat beside me, sometimes in silence, sometimes watching old movies neither of us paid much attention to. And then one night something shifted. I had been scrolling mindlessly through my phone when I saw it. A photo. Luke and Mary, sitting together at a restaurant, their heads close, smiling like they had won. Starting new chapters. A sharp, hollow pain settled in my chest. I turned off my phone and tossed it onto the couch. "Mom." Rael's voice was quiet. I forced a smile, but my vision blurred. "He looks happy." The words felt like glass in my throat. Rael didn't even glance at the phone. He didn't need to. He just exhaled slowly and reached for me, pulling me against him. I didn't resist. I let myself lean into him, let myself feel small for once. His arms tightened around me. "He doesn't deserve a single tear from you." A tear slipped down my cheek anyway. "I don't know how to stop." Rael sighed, his breath warm against my hair. "Then I'll be here until you do." I didn't know how long we sat like that, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone. The days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and grief. No matter how much I tried to force myself forward, to pretend I was healing, the truth was simpler. I wasn't. The pain sat inside me, lodged deep like a stone in my chest, pressing down on my ribs, making every breath feel like an effort. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't move without feeling like the world had shifted into something unfamiliar, something that no longer made sense to me. Rael did everything. He cooked meals I barely touched, cleaned rooms I no longer cared about, filled the fridge with groceries I couldn't bring myself to look at. He was patient in a way I didn't deserve, watching me closely, stepping in when I faltered, never pushing me but always there. "Mom, you have to eat something," he would say gently, setting a plate in front of me, waiting with quiet determination until I took at least a few bites. Some nights, I'd wake up gasping for air, my body heavy with panic, my mind tangled in dreams of Luke's face, his voice, his betrayal, his absence. And every time, Rael was there. He would sit with me in the dark, his presence steady, reassuring, unshaken. I wanted to be okay for him. I wanted to pull myself together, to be the strong mother I had always been. But the weight of everything was too much. And then, one morning, I collapsed. I barely remembered it. Just a flash of dizziness, a rush of nausea, the sound of Rael's voice, sharp and panicked, calling my name as my knees buckled, and the world tilted violently. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a hospital bed, the beeping of machines filling the room, my arms heavy, my body weak. Rael sat beside me, his eyes dark with exhaustion and something else, something close to fear. "Mom," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "You scared me." I swallowed, my throat raw, my thoughts sluggish. "What happened?" "You passed out," he said. "You're dehydrated. Exhausted. The doctor said you've barely been eating, barely sleeping. You." He let out a shaky breath, rubbing his hands over his face before meeting my gaze again. "Mom, you have to let me help you." Something inside me cracked at the desperation in his voice. "I'm trying," I whispered, and for the first time, it was the truth. I was trying. I just didn't know how to do it alone. The doctor prescribed me a sedative, something to calm the storm inside me, to force my body into rest, to quiet the panic that never seemed to fade. For the first time in weeks, I slept. Not the restless, dream-riddled sleep I had been drowning in, but something deeper, something still. And slowly, the edges of my grief softened just enough to breathe again. 2 weeks passed, and though the pain hadn't disappeared, I could function. I could eat without feeling like I was swallowing glass. I could get out of bed without feeling like the weight of the world was pinning me down. It wasn't better, not really, but it was something. Rael never left my side. One evening, I found him in the kitchen, cooking like he had been doing since he came back. The smell of garlic and onions filled the air, rich and familiar. He had his sleeves rolled up, his movements sure and practiced, like he had done this 1,000 times before. I leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "You've gotten good at that," I said, my voice softer than usual. He turned, his lips curving into a small smile. "Had to," he said. "Someone had to keep you fed." A pang of guilt twisted in my chest. "I'm sorry," I murmured, "for putting you through all this." Rael shook his head, wiping his hands on a dish towel before stepping closer. "You don't have to apologize, Mom." His voice was gentle but firm. "I'm exactly where I need to be." I looked at him then, really looked at him. He had always been my boy, my sweet, thoughtful, too perceptive for his own good boy. But standing there in front of me, he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man. And in that moment, I wasn't sure when the shift had happened, when the lines between protector and protected had blurred. I exhaled, forcing a small smile. "Well, I think I'm ready to take back some of my responsibilities." His brow lifted. "Oh yeah, I said. "Starting with dinner. Let me help." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but I'm still the head chef." I let out a quiet laugh, stepping forward to stand beside him at the stove. He handed me a spoon, his fingers brushing against mine for just a second. Warm. Steady. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to safe. We cooked together in silence, the sound of sizzling onions and bubbling sauce filling the space between us. It was simple, but it was enough. Later that night, as we sat at the table, eating the meal we had made together, Rael looked at me with something unreadable in his expression. "I don't think I'm going back to school," he said suddenly. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "What?" "I'm staying," he said, his voice steady. "At least for now. You're not ready to be alone yet." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him he didn't have to do that, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I wasn't ready. The thought of him leaving, of this house being empty again, of the silence creeping back in, it was too much. Are you sure? I asked quietly. Rael nodded. Yeah, I'm sure. A lump formed in my throat. I swallowed hard, blinking back the sudden sting of tears. Okay, I whispered. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I've got you, Mom, he said, just like he had the night he came home. And for the first time, I believed him. The trip was Rael's idea. One morning, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, watching me the way he always did. Like he was trying to measure how much of me was really here and how much of me was still lost in the past. You need to get away, he said suddenly. I blinked, stirring my tea even though I had no intention of drinking it. I don't know. Mom. His voice was gentle but firm. It's time. He had been saying this in different ways for weeks. That I should go out more. That I should do something for myself. That I needed to start living again. But the idea of leaving, of stepping outside the routine I had built just to keep myself upright, felt impossible. Where would we even go? I asked, stalling. Rael grinned. Leave that to me. And just like that, it was decided. A week later, we were on the road. Rael had planned everything, a long drive, a cabin by the lake, fresh air and open skies. No thinking about the past, he told me. Just this. Just now. At first, I resisted. My mind kept drifting back to everything I had lost, to the years I had wasted, to the ghost of a life that no longer existed. But Rael had a way of pulling me into the present. He played music too loud, sang along off-key until I laughed despite myself. He stopped at roadside diners, insisting we try pie in every small town we passed. He pointed out every ridiculous billboard, every odd-looking cloud, every little thing that I would have missed if I had been alone. Somewhere along the way, something shifted. I didn't notice it at first. It was just a warmth, a lightness that had been absent for so long I almost didn't recognize it. But as we neared our destination, as the roads stretched endless before us, I realized I felt good. Maybe not entirely healed, but alive in a way I hadn't been in a long time. And then there was Rael. He had always been my son, my protector, my constant. But on this trip, he was something else too. He was my friend, my anchor, the person who had seen me at my worst and never looked away. That night, after a long day of exploring, we sat by the lake, watching the moon ripple across the water. The air was cool, but I felt warm, comfortable, safe. Rael sat beside me, close but not too close, his presence steady as always. You know, I said, breaking the silence, I never would have done this without you. He smiled, tilting his head to look at me. Yeah, I know. I laughed, shaking my head. You're not supposed to agree so quickly. He shrugged. I just know you, Mom. Better than you think. And he did. That was the thing. Rael knew me, even the parts one didn't want to admit to myself. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the night settling around us. And then, he did something unexpected. He leaned in and pressed a kiss to my forehead. A simple gesture. Soft. Comforting. But something inside me cracked open. I exhaled slowly, closing my eyes for just a second. I liked that, I admitted, surprised by my own words. Rael didn't pull away. If anything, he lingered. Yeah. I nodded, feeling warmth spread through me, something I couldn't quite name. Yeah. And in that moment, everything changed. When we returned home, I felt different. Lighter. Stronger. And for the first time in years, I knew exactly what I wanted. I had always dreamed of working in fashion, of surrounding myself with color and creativity, of building something that was mine. But Luke had never supported the idea. You don't need a job, he used to say. You have everything you need right here. But that wasn't true. So I did it. I applied for a position at a local style and fashion studio, and to my surprise, I got it. Suddenly, my days were filled with fabric swatches and design meetings, with conversations that had nothing to do with my past. I dressed differently, more confidently. I carried myself with a posture that no longer said I am broken, but rather I have rebuilt myself. And people noticed. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers commented on how much I had changed. You look amazing, one of my coworkers told me. Like a whole new person. But it wasn't just the clothes or the makeup. It was something deeper. I was alive again. Rael, of course, took all the credit. You see? He teased one evening as I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my new blazer. Look how I pulled you out of your depression. Now you look better than ever. I laughed, rolling my eyes. Oh, so this was your plan all along? Obviously. He grinned. You're welcome. I turned to face him, shaking my head with mock exasperation. But beneath it, there was something else, gratitude. Love. This is love, Rael, I said softly. You love me, and I am blooming. His smile softened. Yeah, he said. You are. Life became something I never thought it could be mine. For so many years, I had existed in the shadow of someone else's expectations, shaping myself into the version of me that Luke found acceptable, that the world deemed appropriate. But now, with every morning I woke up in my own home, in my own space, doing the work I loved, I realized I had stepped into a life that belonged to me and no one else. Rael eventually returned to university, though not in the same way he had before. He switched to an external program, finishing his degree while working part-time, determined to stay close. I had tried to convince him to go back full-time, to live his life without worrying about me, but he just smiled in that way of his and said, "This is my life, Mom, and I like it just the way it is." I stopped arguing after that. When he graduated, he found a job here, in the same city, as if fate had lined everything up just right. The rhythm of our days settled into something comfortable, something natural. It wasn't the same as before, when he had first come home, when I was drowning in the wreckage of my old life. But it was better. I worked at the fashion studio, watching myself transform along with the fabrics I tailored, the designs I helped bring to life. I saw the way people looked at me differently now. Women at work, old friends who had once pitied me, even strangers on the street. They didn't see a woman who had been abandoned. They saw a woman who had built herself back up, who had dusted herself off and stepped forward, no longer weighed down by the past. And Luke, he was nothing more than a distant memory. I had wondered, at first, if he would ever check in, if he would call Rael, if some part of him would realize what he had lost. But he never did. He had walked away as if the life we built meant nothing, and in time, I stopped expecting anything different. And that was the strangest part. Not that Luke didn't care, but that I no longer cared that he didn't care. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't waiting for closure. I had already given it to myself. One evening, as Rael and I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set over the city, he leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head. You ever think about what life would be like if none of this had happened? I tilted my head, considering his words. If Luke hadn't left? He nodded. I thought about it for a moment, really let myself sit with the idea. And then, to my own surprise, I laughed softly. You know what? I don't think I'd change a thing. Rael glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. Yeah. I took a sip of my wine, feeling the cool breeze against my skin. Because if none of this had happened, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be this version of myself. And I kind of like her. Rael grinned. I told you I pulled you out of your depression. I rolled my eyes, nudging his arm. Oh, so you're taking all the credit? Obviously. He smirked. I mean, look at you. Thriving. Glowing. Living your best life. Who do you think made that happen? I shook my head, smiling. Well, I do owe you a lot. He shrugged. You don't owe me anything, Mom. I just wanted you to be happy again. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The young man who had once been my little boy, who had stepped in when I needed him most, who had never once let me fall. I am, I said softly. I really am. And for the first time, I truly meant it.